We're looking at Galen Strawson's views on moral responsibility, and we can put it very succinctly. He claims that there is no such thing as moral responsibility. So we're going to look at the argument here in part one. It starts with the idea of an infinite regress. We need to understand what an infinite regress is in order to understand his formal argument, at least. Let me just run through a couple quick examples. In mathematics, we can define the set of natural numbers with a regressive definition. So we say a natural number is 1 and 1 plus any natural number. And that will get you a regress. It's a perfectly fine definition. It's workable, it's reasonable. It is an infinite regress, but it's not vicious. It does describe the natural numbers. So that's fine. On the other hand, in the ancient world, it is said that some people claimed that the earth rested on the back of a turtle. And of course, when asked, what does the turtle rest on? The story goes, the answer is it's turtles all the way down. Well, that would be an infinite regress, but that would be vicious. That's a problem. That doesn't explain really what the earth is resting on. And of course, it's now known as a kind of a silly question, but to think it's turtles infinitely just doesn't make sense. So that's a vicious regress. That's a problematic regress. And those sometimes occur in everyday life. So here with Dilbert, his boss asking him for the update on the status report. And of course, in the middle panel there, Dilbert makes it clear what he's doing. You're asking for a status report on the status of the status report. And then he says, right, when can I get that? And Dilbert is pulling out the infinite regress there. If you continually ask for the status report on the status of the status, you get it, right? That's a problem. Okay, now let's step back, and we're going to take 3 shots at this argument. That's what Strawson does. And we put it fairly intuitively first, and then we get a little more and a little more technical as we go. So first of all, he says nothing can be causa sui, the cause of itself. Nothing can cause itself to come into being, would be one way of saying this. That seems reasonable. And he says, in order to be truly morally responsible, if we're applying this to moral responsibility, in order to be morally responsible for one's actions, one would have to be causa sui, right? The cause of one's actions, and only you being the loci of the cause of the action. So at least in crucial mental respects, it seems like that would need to be the case, but it's not. So therefore, nothing and no one can be truly morally responsible for anything that they do, right? This isn't limited to any particular action. So that's a rough idea of the argument. Let's take it up a notch in terms of the formality. That one, there's not a lot to work with criticizing those premises. They're still somewhat vague and general. So we take a second shot at this. In order to be morally responsible, one must act for a reason. You have to have a reason to act the way that you do. And if somebody's completely out of reason, we say they would be mentally ill, and we don't hold a mentally ill person morally responsible for what they do in their illness. And the reason that you have for doing the action, it has to come from one's mental states. Okay, so in order to be morally responsible, one must have consciously chosen their mental states. Okay, that seems reasonable so far. But then he says, wait a minute, no one can choose in a conscious, reasoned fashion to have the mental states that they have. And if that's the case, then no one can ever be morally responsible for their actions. So that is a little bit more formally structured. We have a little bit more to work with. And let's keep that fourth premise in mind, because that seems to be the questionable premise, right? That's the premise that seems to be the weak spot that one might attack. So when he says no one can choose in a conscious, reasoned fashion to have the mental states that they have, well, why think that, right? Why think that no one can choose to have the mental states they have? It seems like we could. Strawson's first response, and we'll make this a little bit more formal here in our version 3, is that, well, your mental states are ultimately determined by heredity and previous experiences. That's what determines your mental states. And any attempt to change those, of course, none of us at this time can change our heredity, at least, and you can't change your previous experiences, but that would be founded on those two things. So you can't change either one of these things. We can't go back in the past. We can't change our genetic makeup. It seems like premise 4 is therefore true. Now, we'll continue to examine this. Right? Strawson does make a concession of sorts, right? That's in quotes, because he concedes that we often find ourselves in situations where we believe we are truly radically free, morally responsible, able to choose our mental states. It seems to us that we can do this. So, for example, I believe I could mention some things completely unrelated to this video. I believe I could mention pink-spotted unicorns, or a large friendly orc who comes by and mows my lawn for fun. I believe I could leave work right after this video and go home and watch some college hoops. As I record this, it's March Madness in the US, the college basketball tournament, something that I enjoy. And when that's going on, it seems like I have the option to do that. But I'm not the only one, of course. This view is shared by many philosophers. Clearly, Sartre is someone who says we're radically free. Kant seems to think this as well. It's not clear who else he might put into this category. It's not clear whether, say, a libertarian like Whitaker or Kane or O'Connor or Van Inwagen would affirm that we are radically free in the way that is problematic for Strawson's view. But in any case, due to the basic argument, Strawson says we need to reject these ideas that we have that kind of freedom. And he argues there's this fundamental sense in which, because of that, because we're never free and really responsible for what we do, no punishment or reward is ever ultimately just. Now, he's including, legal punishments and rewards. It, of course, might depend on your legal theories, but he's also including, any interpersonal punishment or reward, or a parent for a child punishing or rewarding a child for doing what's bad or good. He says ultimately that idea is unjust. And so let's formalize this as best we can, Strawson's view, and make sure that we're really clear what his reasoning is. You do what you do in any situation because of the way you are in that situation. Now, let's call that your nature. Now, in this case, your nature is not some vague reference to your heredity or the way you are as a person. it's fairly specific here. We're talking about the way you are at that particular time, your nature, your mental states, all the properties that you have will include that in your nature, but this is a short term, right? This is just at that time that you're acting. We can talk about your nature then. So this N1, this nature, it's a fairly technical idea, right? So to be truly responsible for what you do, you have to be truly responsible for having that nature N1 at the time that you do something, because it's that nature that causes you to do what you do. So in order to be truly responsible for having your nature N1, that means if you're truly responsible, you had to intentionally bring about having that nature N1. You had to choose having that nature. And you had to be truly responsible for that intention to bring about that nature. Now we're starting to see a little pattern building up. In order to have intentionally brought about having N1 and, having that intention, having it be you, you had to have a prior nature N2 in light of which you intentionally brought about N1, right? It had to come from you. It had to be your prior nature, and we're just calling that N2 sometime in the past, previously taking into account all the properties that you have at that time when you intentionally brought about N1. But in order to be truly responsible for having the intention to bring about N1, you had to be truly responsible for having that nature N2 from which the intention to bring about N1 came, right? Now, in order to be truly responsible for having your nature N2, you had to intentionally bring about having N2, and we can see the problem is brewing here. You had to be truly responsible for that intention, but of course, in order to have intentionally brought about the having N2, you had to have a prior nature from which that intention came, in light of which you intentionally brought about N2. And then, of course, you're going to have to be responsible for that nature. And there is no stopping point to this process. This is a vicious regress, right? It just goes back in time until, let's take it to the point when you're an infant, when you're newborn. Did you choose your parents? Did you choose the environment in which you were born? Of course, none of us did, but those are extremely crucial for our nature. And of course, you can keep pushing this as far back as you want. It's a vicious regress. It's an infinite regress. It's therefore impossible to be truly responsible for what you do in anything, right? No matter what we're talking about. And therefore, again, we can assert, says Strawson, that no punishment and no reward is ever ultimately just. There is no moral responsibility. We should not punish people. We should not reward people. No one is morally responsible for what they do. That is Strawson's view. Now, that is not the view of everyone, of course, and so we need to expand this a little more, consider some possible objections, as we will do in part 2.